This evening, you're going to be hearing from Soraya, Jake, Zara and Jacob, who are the master students and masterminds behind the Lockdown Dreams project. They're going to tell you about what they've been doing and something about what we've been finding so far. I'm going to then present some thoughts and reflections of my own on the project to date, and we're extremely lucky this evening to be joined by Professor Daniel Pick, who's also going to be sharing some thoughts on the project and on the dreams that we've all been experiencing. Daniel is a psychoanalyst and fellow of the British Psychoanalytic Society. He's also a professor of history at Birkbeck. Daniel's presented a variety of programmes about history, politics and psychoanalysis over the last 10 years for BBC Radio. He's written many books. These include The Pursuit of the Nazi Mind, Hitler, Hess and the Analysts, Psychoanalysis, A Very Short Introduction, a book called Dreams and History, which is an edited book, and most recently Psychoanalysis in the Age of Totalitarianism. They're all really fascinating and highly recommend them to you all. Daniel's also the senior investigator on a team-based research project on the Cold War, the human sciences and brainwashing, which was funded by the Wellcome Trust. You can find out more about that if you Google Hidden Persuaders. That's the title of the project. You'll find the Hidden Persuaders website, which again there's lots of fascinating information on there if you'd like to know more. I am going to put some slides up and I'm going to turn it over to Soraya, Jake and Zara, who are going to start by giving you an introduction to the project and some of their preliminary findings.
Hi, thanks Liz. So to start off the webinar, we're going to be talking about our group's research on lockdown dreams. So we are a group of postgraduate psychoanalysis students at the unit. The idea for the project came from a discussion amongst us before our class on Zoom one day. After the UK lockdown at the end of March, we had noticed that we had all been experiencing unusually vivid dreams. A quick look at social media showed an absolute outpouring of reports from people all over the world, noting experiences of unusually vivid dreams and also memorable dreams. So this slide just shows some headlines and trending hashtags that really showcase the prevalence of this phenomenon. So these are two graphs from Google showing the search trends for lockdown dreams or vivid dreams over the past couple months. Just to get some key dates in, lockdown started on the 23rd of March and our project began on the 6th of April. The peak of trending searches was in the last week of April or a month into lockdown. So if you see at the end of the graph, the searches are slowly creeping up again, just as lockdown 2.0 has begun. So this slide shows a quick summary of the inception of lockdown dreams and some key dates. But interestingly, this tweet on the left-hand side is the first mention of lockdown dreams on Twitter. And the screenshot on the right-hand side shows the newspaper headline from April 6th, the day we started the project. And also, coincidentally, the day Boris Johnson was hospitalized for COVID-19. So this is the context in which our project started. As a group of postgraduate students familiar with psychoanalytic theory, we just wanted to contribute to the body of work looking into the pandemic in the best capacity we could. Potentially notable as well is that we were partially inspired by Charlotte Berat's work, which I know Liz Ellison and Daniel Pick will speak about later, and also other work on dream archiving. And essentially, we just wanted to ensure that the emotional aspects of living through this exceptional period were not lost to the sands of time. So formally, our project aims to explore the relationship between the imagistic and emotional content of people's dreams and their self-reported experience of the pandemic. So we wanted to find patterns in the dreams submitted and to infer meaning from those patterns. More informally, we want to document this apparent upsurge in dream material and notably more vivid dreams and see how our dreams are changing over time, and also see how COVID-19 and paraphernalia like face masks and Zoom calls are appearing in our dreams. So hopefully the insights offered by an analysis of this data set will be of value to mental health practitioners working with patients whose disturbances are related to the pandemic, for example. But if anything as well, compiling an archive of the data gathered allows us to really capture the extraordinary present moment for future reflection and also for public engagement. So now over to Jake, who will be giving some stats.
Thanks, Soraya. Hello, everyone. So to start with, I want to say a bit about the ways in which we collected the data. I think it's important to run through this as we put a lot of consideration into the kind of information that we wanted to collect from people. Details like demographics, how people were feeling generally, as well as the actual content of the dream and associations to it. All really important for drawing out more in-depth conclusions. An example of this would be, what answer best describes your current living arrangements? That was a question on the form. In this way, we hope to capture a specific moment in time and those affected as well. So here's a really general breakdown of the demographics on the slide you can see now. The majority of which coming from English-speaking parts of the world, mainly from the UK and Canada. The Canadian responses are in line with an interview I did for the national broadcaster. But in total, we have responses from 31 countries around the world, which is absolutely fantastic. A real testament to the fact that dreaming during the pandemic really did catch the public's imagination. In terms of gender, 75% of our respondents identify as female, which I'd like to point out as such a large number is particularly interesting. Aside from that, the majority of respondents are either working from home, residing at home, furlough or otherwise. Although, despite being removed from the immediate danger of the virus, the threat of corona is still very present. We can see this in the 5 sample dreams that you've been sent, where the virus takes on other forms. Okay, so what we have found, this is the most important thing. I must stress from the start that all of this data is based on what we've collected so far, and we're not necessarily presuming this is going to hold true consistently as the project goes on. But I thought I'd just start with that. So the standout thing is that 71% of respondents are having more vivid dreams compared to the period before lockdown began, which provides an answer to the overarching question of the project in a way. Currently, people are reporting more vivid dreams right now during this second lockdown as compared to the first, which is the case with nearly 50% of respondents. You can see that in the pie chart bottom right. 71% of respondents are feeling anxious generally. Either the dream is anxiety laden or people are waking up and feeling anxious, and that's reflected in that other figure on the page. 64% of respondents reported feeling anxious in their day-to-day, which really speaks to that low-key anxiety that I'm sure most of us have felt at some point during the pandemic. Okay, so here you can see a very basic representation of the words used within dreams from our data set. While I'm talking, just have a look and see if any feel particularly familiar for you. On the left, we have the content of the dream. So these are the prevalent words within the dream itself. And on the right, we have the emotional response to that dream. One of the questions that was asked was, how did you feel upon waking? So these are taken from those responses. In terms of specific words, you can see on the left, aside from the word dream, that homes and the immediate built environment feature very heavily. And clearly what's occupying people's thoughts are the spaces they're now restricted to. On the right, the overwhelming majority of people are feeling anxious and confused. And I think one really important facet of collecting data like this, and especially as it's so easy for the human element to get lost in amongst all the pie charts, is that we must always be aware that it's tied to an individual's lived experience. And I know I speak for the others when I say that it's really humbling to see that so much of how we're feeling is shared across continents even. Okay, so I'm going to pass you over to Zara now, who's going to talk a bit about the thematic elements arising from our dreams.
Thank you, Jake. Hi, everyone. So before we move on to looking at some of the key themes arising from lockdown dreams, I'd just like to talk briefly about what's not appearing in the dream, so we can have that in mind too. So firstly, hand washing. Now, hand washing is really conspicuous by its absence, particularly due to the ubiquity of the medical advice and all the public health messaging around washing our hands. If you remember back in the very early days of the pandemic, here in the UK, all the school children were being asked to wash their hands to the tune of Happy Birthday. Every single public briefing contained references to hand washing, and we haven't had a single dream where it appears. Secondly, economic concerns. So in some sense, equal to the trauma and the anxiety surrounding the health problems in this pandemic are the economic implications and the fallout from lockdown. And whilst we've certainly had dreams communicating anxiety around the distribution of resources, so for example, concern that the shops are closed due to lockdown and that people might not be able to access supplies, what we're not seeing are dreams about people losing their jobs or being made redundant and not being able to financially support themselves. Thirdly, dreams of a vaccine. So we could say that dreaming of a vaccine is the ultimate worldwide wish fulfillment fantasy to make the virus go away and get back to our old way of life. Despite all the talk of a vaccine, we're not seeing any representations of injections or vaccines. And lastly, and very interestingly for our international audience, so bugs, spiders and insects. Dr. Deirdre Beradt, whose work a lot of you will be familiar with, all of her work on dream collection, has undertaken extensive research on pandemic dreams collected mainly from North America. And her work has noticed that many of the dreams feature representations of insects and bugs. Now, this isn't something that we've seen in our dreams so far. And one theory about this is that the virus has been commonly referred to colloquially as a bug in North America, much more so than in other parts of the world. But I'm sure lots of you will have ideas about this, and we're looking forward to hear those later. I'm now going to give a very brief overview of some of the key themes that we're finding emerging from these dreams. And I must stress once again, these are preliminary observations and reactions to the material, rather than formal conclusions or results. As some of you who have had the chance to read the dreams that we shared ahead of this webinar may have noticed, these dreams seem at first glance to be intensely idiosyncratic and personal, and drawing overviews and conclusions from hundreds and hundreds of these dreams can seem a daunting and difficult task, and often it is, but nonetheless we can make some initial comments which we hope will provide content for our reflection and also discussion at this stage in dream collection. So I'd like to just bring out 4 of these themes that you can see here in this slide. And I'm going to read out some very short examples of sentences picked out from the dream material to bring this experience to life a bit. So firstly, representations of COVID-19. So those of you who've read the sample dreams will remember that the first dream is about a government gas that's been introduced to control people. So here we have the idea of COVID as this airborne virus translating into a deadly gas. You can see that's quite an easy step to make. Other dreamers have recounted an air of more generalized persecutory menace. And here are 2 short sentences to illustrate that. I dreamt there was a sickness going round and it turned people angry and violent. There was a menace that we were escaping from. It was very active and scary. Secondly, Zoom and screens. So the ubiquity of video conferencing calls and webinars like this one and screen-based interactions have transformed the world of work, education and psychoanalysis almost overnight. And we find that the paraphernalia of this modern pandemic popping up in our dreams almost immediately. The workplace is invading our dreams as it's also invaded our homes, and old fears are giving a new pandemic twist. So here's some examples. I dreamt that I accidentally dialed into a meeting with colleagues on MS Teams without realizing I was naked. comments one dreamer, which is a new take on the naked anxiety dream. I caught myself on Zoom picking my nose extravagantly and eating the bogey in full view of everyone else on the screen. And this dreamer reports being shocked and horrified by this, but also sees the humour in it. For many of these dreamers, they're also saying that this is the first time they've had a dream about Zoom or video conferencing. Thirdly, face masks. So face masks make their way into many of our dreams. Here's an example of how they appear in a classic exam anxiety scenario. I dreamed that I was taking a test in a large lecture hall at my university, and one of the requirements for me to be able to take the test was that I had to construct a face mask. Face masks also pop up ruining social occasions, in this case, a wedding. I dreamt that I was attending a summer wedding and all the bridal party in white were wearing wedding attire with designer C19 masks. The masks were made of glittery fabric, lace and gold and silver. We couldn't hear anything they were saying, including the toast to the couple. And lastly, social distancing. So the social distancing rule, more than anything else, appears to really have sunken into our unconscious. There's a palpable sense of outrage in many of our dreams at the lack of social distancing going on in the dreams. Moral indignation, often breaking out into anger. And here's two quick examples. I became aware that more customers were coming in and getting physically close to me. I started panicking and holding out my arms so they wouldn't come closer and screaming at the top of my voice at everyone, "You're not social distancing." Another dream. I really enjoyed the hug and I wondered to myself in the dream why it was so nice to get a hug. And then I slowly remembered about COVID-19 and social distancing and isolation. And I started freaking out and yelling at everyone at the party about we had to leave right away. I was scared we were all going to be fined and about us all getting sick and spreading COVID-19. I woke up right after that realization. So hopefully that's given you a very broad introduction and overview of the project and some of the fascinating dreams that have been sent in. We assume that many of the hundreds of you here on this webinar have already shared some of your dreams with us, and we encourage you all to continue to take part and to continue to send us your dreams. You just simply go to lockdowndreams.com and click on submit a dream, as you can see by this arrow. And you can also please get in touch with us directly via email. And I believe that Jacob is adding this email address to the chat now. And finally, to wrap up our short presentation, we really believe that psychoanalysis can offer a unique and a rich contribution to the dream discourse today. And the theories and vocabulary of psychoanalysis give us ways into thinking about the mind and of how we're all processing the intermingling of the pressing external pandemic anxieties with our own personal histories and internal passions. So thank you very much. Send us your dreams, and over to you, Liz. Thank you.
Thanks very much to all of you. I'm sure you'll agree that that was utterly fascinating, and I'm sure people have got lots of thoughts and questions that they'd like to ask. If you can just hold on to those for a little while longer, there will be plenty of time for us to talk as a group. I'm going to start what I wanted to say just by sharing with you 3 quotations taken from very different sources. I'm not going to comment on these, I'm just going to kind of leave them hanging to have in your mind as I continue. So the first one is taken from the New York Times on April 13th this year. A journalist named Katie Weaver wrote in an article about lockdown dreams. As the new coronavirus's grip strengthens to a chokehold, waking life itself, for many, has taken on an odd, dreamlike air. The second one is from the psychoanalyst W.R. Bion in his book, Learning from Experience. He writes near the beginning of that book, "The patient who cannot dream, cannot go to sleep, and cannot wake up." And the third and final one is taken from Charlotte Beradt's book, The Third Reich of Dreams. This is a really fascinating book, which is, Charlotte Beradt was a writer who collected dreams that people were having during the time of the Nazi regime, and after the war, she published a book about the dreams and her reflections on them. I'll say a bit more about that a bit later on, but this is just a short quotation from her introduction to the book. Dream imagery might thus help to describe the structure of a reality that was just on the verge of becoming a nightmare. Okay, so why are we all here this evening? There's lots of us here, which is wonderful to see. What is it about this phenomenon that provokes such interest? I think that it's curiosity, and it's curiosity about our minds. Dreams make us curious about our minds, both our own minds and the minds of others. Do others have experiences like this, we wonder, or is it just us? You know, I think being curious about our minds is a wonderful and important thing. But should we really take our dreams seriously? Well, as you probably all know, Sigmund Freud insisted that we should take our dreams seriously, and he gave two key reasons for this in his book, The Interpretation of Dreams, and elsewhere. So the first reason is that Freud thought that individual dreams, when properly understood, have just as much meaning as we find in other psychical structures. He believed that dreams have a validity and importance equal to that of any other mental act. And his belief that that was the case flew in the face of, you know, the opinions of many other authorities at the time that he wrote The Interpretation of Dreams. So that's one reason. The content of the dreams, when properly understood, is just as important as anything else that goes on in our minds. And the second reason that Freud thought dreams were so important and found it so important to think about them is that for him, interpreting dreams gave him a window through which he gained some of his most important insights into how our minds work. And I think we're all very conscious right now of how hard our minds are having to work as they attempt to process our emotional reactions to the unprecedented situation that we're facing at the moment. And I think we all intuitively recognize that our prolific and vivid dreams are an index of that. Two of the commonest reflections on the dreams that we've received is, first of all, how vivid they are. As Jake was saying earlier, many people have commented on the vividness of the dreams. It's unusual how vivid they are. And the other thing that comes up a lot in the commentary about the dreams that people submit is that they often feel, even after a full night of sleep and dreaming, as tired as if they haven't slept at all. Producing these dreams is hard work, it's tiring. So I think both of those phenomena are indications of the hard work that's going on. So usually, and certainly this was true of how Freud originally thought about dreams, we tend to think about dreams as related to very personal and private concerns. But what is it that dreams that occur in times of crisis can tell us about the mind's struggle to get to grips with realities that dramatically impinge on the personal and private sphere? This question has been asked in other times of crisis. There are other examples of dream collections being put together in difficult times, like Charlotte Beradt's collection in the time of the Nazi regime. There have also been reports of dream surges after events like war or natural disasters, or something like 9/11. There were a lot of reports of vivid and strange dreams after that. So if we think about this current situation of crisis that we're in now, what are the specific challenges or impingements that the pandemic faces us with? I think we can think of quite a few quite quickly. So first of all, the threat of mortality, the recognition of our own mortality that the pandemic sort of forces on us in a way that it hadn't been so necessary to think about before. The threat of economic hardship, perhaps severe economic hardship, as one of the consequences of the pandemic. loss of contact with loved ones, and indeed loss of loved ones, is another aspect to it. Loss of our freedoms. We're not free to go about our business in the way that we normally would at the moment, and we haven't been for some time. Exposure of the holes in the safety nets that we thought protected us, which we've seen, in the strain on health services and in the disparities in the care available to different social groups. Related to that, the exposure and the widening of social inequalities. And of course, the exposure of inadequacies of leadership at many levels, from local to national. So what is it that dreams in times of crisis, like the current crisis, are telling us about? Going back to Charlotte Beradt's book, The Third Reich of Dreams, I'm going to read you now a passage giving her thoughts about what the dreams that she was collecting were telling her, which I'll also put on the screen. When a person sits down to keep a diary, this is a deliberate act, and he remolds, clarifies, or obscures his reactions. But while seeming to record seismographically the slightest effects of political events on the psyche, these dreams, these diaries of the night, were conceived independently of their author's conscious will. They were, so to speak, dictated to them by dictatorship. Dream imagery might thus help to describe the structure of a reality that was just on the verge of becoming a nightmare. And she goes on, the dreams that we're concerned with in this book were not produced by conflicts arising in their author's private realm, and certainly not by some past conflict that had left a psychological wound. So in her view, the dreams that she collected were important primarily for what they revealed about the structure of the socio-political reality that these dreamers were living through. The book, The Third Reich of Dreams, also includes a commentary on Beradt's findings by the psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim. And I'm going to read you an extract from what he says about the dreams too. And he takes a different view. I thus differ with the author, who feels that these dreams do not deal with internal conflicts, but only with political realities of the moment, and the dreamer's conflicts with society. I believe instead that they have their roots in the inner conflicts evoked by social realities within the person who dreams them. So there's a debate between the two about, what is really significant about these dreams. And I think the disagreement between them raises or focuses the question of to what extent do social realities reflect intrapsychic conflict, and to what extent do they shape these conflicts? And what further complicates any attempt to answer that question, I think, is that, and Freud certainly found this, the only way really to approach the intrapsychic is via metaphor. When he was writing his book on the interpretation of dreams, he was in correspondence with a friend. He wrote many letters to this friend about his struggles to produce the book. And one of the things that he complained about to this friend was that he found that his style did not please him because it was full of metaphors, and he found it affected. I'll just read you a little quote to illustrate that. He complains to his friend, "The involved sentences of my book on dreams, bolstered up on indirect phrases and with sidelong glances at their subject matter, have gravely affronted some ideal within me. When it comes to the mind, we kind of have to approach it via sidelong glances." And when Freud was writing the interpretation of dreams, the book is stuffed with metaphors, and he very often makes use of political and military metaphors to describe the psyche. And so I'll just give you one famous example of that. It's passage where he's talking about the relationship between thoughts that the dreamer may have had the day before the dream and the wishes that get themselves represented in the dream. A daytime thought, he says, may very well play the part of entrepreneur for a dream. But the entrepreneur, who, as people say, has the idea and the initiative to carry it out, can do nothing without capital. He needs a capitalist who can afford the outlay. And the capitalist who provides the psychical outlay for the dream is invariably and indisputably, whatever may be the thoughts of the previous day, a wish from the unconscious. The reality with which we're dealing, our mind, is not available to our senses. And here's another quote from the psychoanalyst Wilfred Bion. In his book Attention and Interpretation, he wrote, "The realizations with which a psychoanalyst deals cannot be seen or touched. Anxiety has no shape or color, smell or sound." And we can think of our dreams as attempts to deal with these oppressive yet intangible realities, first by giving a shape to them. And in thinking about the project and the dreams that have been collected so far, one of the things that's interested me is that the coronavirus seems to be like the unconscious itself, in that for the most part it seems to have to be represented via metaphors, because of course the virus itself is not visible to the naked eye. So we see metaphors like vampires, zombies, a tsunami, the toxic gas that you saw in the specimen dreams that we shared with you. So I think just to give some examples of the conflicts that go on in our minds that the experience of the pandemic, I think, has stirred up and that take a particular shape in the dreams that we've been collecting. So first of all, the experience of helplessness and the wish to assert dominance. And this, of course, goes right back to infancy, the helplessness of the baby, the omnipotence of the toddler. So in the dreams that we've been collecting, there have been many, many dreams about flying and airports. I think this is really interesting because if you think about the word flight, it's like a switch word, because flight is, getting on an airplane and traveling, but also flight means running away, escaping. And what we see in the dreams is many, many dreams about not so much flying, but trying to fly, trying to go to an airport, trying to get on a plane, but not being able to because the dreamer has lost their passport or hasn't got the right luggage or can't find the way to the airport or hasn't left enough time to get there. There are lots of examples of that. Another notable conflict, which I think the experience of the pandemic gives a kind of new life to, is aggressive impulses towards loved ones and suspicion and hostility towards those on whom we also depend. I mean, there's lots of psychoanalytic writing about the ambivalence of our closest attachments, where there's love, there's also hate. And, one of the challenges of the pandemic situation is not knowing who's a safe person. You can't know who's got the virus. It might be your nearest and dearest, and you may not know until it's too late. And there are, again, a lot of dreams in the collection about trusted persons who turn out to be not what they seem to be. I can think of an example of a dream of someone at a party and enjoying themselves and then realizing that all the women in the party were vampires. That would be an example of that. And a third kind of, I think, ubiquitous conflict, which again is stirred up in a particular way by the experience of the pandemic, is the wish to deny unwelcome reality. And we're all familiar with that wish. We all know what it's like to wish that something horrible that was happening was not happening, and even to pretend that it's not happening. And I'm sure we can all think of examples of people, perhaps in very prominent physicians who've been trying to do that. And, you know, I think one of the ways that that gets figured in the dreams in our collection is the dreams that we have about government agencies taking control of the media and controlling what information can be released. So a kind of censorship of the truth. It's a, which, you know, if you think about the interpretation of dreams and Freud's writing about repression initially in terms of a censor, you can see that there's a kind of political framing there as well. So I'm going to finish these remarks with a thought about a particular aspect of facing unwelcome reality, which is the need now and then to take a good hard look at ourselves. And this is often a deeply uncomfortable experience. And I think that the pandemic has notably been forcing that experience on us as a condition of being connected to others. In fact, we're having it now. We're all looking at images of ourselves, unless we've turned off our camera, in order to be connected to this conversation. Looking at ourselves can be disconcerting, challenging, even uncanny. I'm going to read you one of my favourite passages from Freud's essay on the uncanny, in which he describes his own experience of unexpectedly being confronted with an image of himself and how unpleasant that was. And this is the passage. It happened on a train. I was sitting alone in my wagon-lee compartment when a more than usually violent jolt of the train swung back the door of the adjoining washing cabinet, and an elderly gentleman in a dressing gown and a travelling cap came in. I assumed that in leaving the washing cabinet, which lay between the two compartments, he'd taken the wrong direction and come into my compartment by mistake. Jumping up with the intention of putting him right, I at once realised to my dismay that the intruder was nothing but my own reflection in the looking glass on the open door. I can still recollect, he says, that I thoroughly disliked his appearance. And as Zara already mentioned, we've seen quite a few dreams about virtual meetings and that experience of suddenly catching yourself in some undesirable act, like appearing naked on Zoom, or the extravagant nose picking that she mentioned. And there they are again on the screen to remind you. I'm going to read you another one, which I found very striking in that vein. I was on an internet interface where I could see my face framed in the computer screen. I looked carefully at my face and began to notice and focus my attention on the overly large and pendulous jowls that hung down in two halves from under my chin to my chest. At the bottom of each jowl, where they touched my upper chest, I noticed that they're formed of two gonad-sized spheres encased in saggy, scrotal, dark pink skin. Each gonad sphere is shaped like a coronavirus cell, with protruding points showing through, but encased inside the skin. And I think that these dreams are a nice metaphor for something that dreams do, which is, and what this is one of the things that Freud recognized in the interpretation of dreams. Dreams give us a glimpse of our minds at work. They allow us to see ourselves looking, and this can be very unsettling. But if we can bear it, then that process of self-examination has the potential to be quite transformative. And just as a final kind of illustration of what I mean, as has already been said, there are many dreams in our collection of trying to socially distance, being impinged on in different ways by rude, aggressive, greedy, pushy others. So how might things change, both on an individual and on a social level, if we began to contemplate the possibility that these rude, aggressive, greedy, pushy impulses might also exist in us? And I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Daniel.
First of all, to thank you and the group for, both for the presentations today, which are fascinating, and for the project, and for introducing us all to the project. And I think the discussion could go in many directions. And Liz, you've already provided a number of contexts and sort of lines of thinking that we could all develop further. So I have, you know, lots of things come to my mind. And when we've been corresponding recently about it, you know, I find lots of different thoughts. I mean, partly the poignancy of some of the dreams that have just been reported to us today. I mean, so one could go into individual dreams that have been brought and what they tell us, or the sort of patterns, the configurations of dreams, which I think the team are very interested in, you know, not just sort of, as it were, isolated, discrete dreams of particular people, but the sort of the coming together, the convergence of certain recurrent themes in society, so of which these are manifestations. So we could look at the dream content. We could also go in other directions as well, as I think you've all been inviting us to do as well. I mean, one of the things to think about is the history of the endeavor, of which this is just the latest manifestation, and you've also alluded to that. So one can say, well, this is part of a venerable tradition that goes back long before psychoanalysis. I mean, I think Jesuits in the 17th century collected dreams, you know, in far-flung parts of the world. There's a kind of long history of collecting dreams and in the hope that they would tell you something. There's a history of the kind of anthropological interest in dreams across the world. So this project seems to be connected to it, and you've obviously been thinking a lot about Charlotte Berat's amazing project, the third, you know, which culminated in that book published in much later in the 60s, The Third Reich of Dreams, which is, you know, it really ought to be back in wide circulation. It seems so kind of timely in a way. You know, I was struck that you quoted from it. I'll just quote something else from her book, where she says, she's describing the dreams she attends to and discounts. For some reason, she discounts certain dreams, like dreams of violence and war, which she just thinks are recurrent through the ages. And she's trying to focus on dreams that are really telling you something about fascism and totalitarianism and the period. So she makes some questionable, you know, choices, methodological choices. But anyway, she then insists that these dreams are not really to do with the inner world and psychic conflicts of the dreamer, but are really much more to, you know, to do with as it were, the surface of the dream is what's interesting, not the depth of the dreamer. She writes, quote, "Instead, they arose from conflicts into which these people had been driven by a public realm in which half-truths, vague notions, and a combination of fact, rumor, and conjecture had produced general feeling of uncertainty and unrest." So there's something of the febrile, anxious, disturbing climate of the 30s in Germany that she's trying to sort of document and archive through the dreams. Now, as you've, I think, also perhaps alluded to, there is a fundamental argument that she has, well, Bettelheim has with her, but in a way that she has with Freud, for whom, in a way, there's a limit to what you can glean from dreams without a dreamer, because Freud wants the dreamer to associate. I mean, he's not just saying there's a manifest dream, there's a text. He's interested in what you can discover through a patient who then begins with the dream, or even with his own dreams in his great dream book, which you talk about, but, you know, where a very brief bit of text, like the botanical monograph dream, a couple of lines, leads to a sort of massive hinterland of thoughts once he starts to associate from the manifest to the, as it were, the underlying thoughts. And I think you've been talking about that and the dream work, or the psychic work. I think you were saying the labor the psychic work that we're all kind of busy in the night trying to sort of process something, for better or for worse. But the question for historians or social scientists, anthropologists, you know, in dialogue with Freud is, what can we do with dreams where we don't necessarily have the dreamer on the couch to work on their own dreams with the analyst? And I think you're saying there's lots, you know, your project is saying there's lots we can think about with all of this. But I suppose I'm just in a way coming back to that question with Freud, the risk of wild analysis, as he'd say, you know, where you just use a dream without knowing the associations, or of ending up back in the sort of pre-Freudian tradition, because there was a tradition of dream books in the Victorian period, of just where certain things symbolize certain other things, and you read off like code, you know, this equals that. And Freud sometimes reverts to that himself in a sort of more Victorian fashion, but the thrust of his argument is against that. Just as it's kind of, Freud's also in dialogue with the Bible and the idea of dreams as prophecy, of course. I was struck actually looking back at the Third Reich of dreams, the epigraph at the beginning of the book, where it's a quotation from the book of Job and the Old Testament and the function of dreams and what comes to you in, I think in the quotation, it's something like in the sort of visions in the night. So I think there's lots to discuss. You also, I mean, just to take another thing you just mentioned is metaphor, which is so interesting, the metaphors that on which psychoanalysis is founded and the politics of those metaphors, like censorship and repression and defense and all the connotations. And indeed, you know, the dream book is kind of shot through with references to the Habsburg Empire and things going on at the time. I mean, the politics of dreams, but also the architecture of psychoanalysis that has a politics and metaphors. And I was thinking, as you were talking, you were mentioning the virus as a, you know, something that also has a metaphorical dimension. I mean, both the virus is something that's invisible, but also when we talk about the computer virus, that words also morph from one context to another, or ideas that now go viral, which is part of the febrile climate you're talking about. And that it's hard to disentangle, as it were, our disturbance that we're all, everyone, or so many people are feeling in the age of COVID, and how one disentangles that from the other crises of our time with which it intersects. So that the way in which the COVID crisis transforms the political crisis, or the way in which the political crisis also mediates the way we understand the COVID crisis, populism, the election in the US, which for many of us has been in a way engrossing, you know, and terrifying and sort of unstoppable. You can't stop watching it. So the ecological crisis and so on. And I thought even lockdown is a metaphor of imprisonment, that we, you know, in your title, Lockdown Dreams, I mean, that's another metaphor of the idea of a kind of imprisonment. And for the benefit of whom, and so on, and which is also shrouded in all sorts of political issues. So there are lots of, I won't go on, I mean, I'll pause there, but I think there are many ways this could go. But final thought is just that these kinds of collective dream projects often in the past seem to have come out of a period of conflict. I think, as you're saying, in the aftermath of war, in the age of Cold War, you know, that seemed to be, as it were, the need to be gathering collective experiences of dreams where emotions, affects are all on the line and everything feels so kind of raw, that there's something that seems to draw researchers to undertaking projects like yours.
Thanks, Daniel. I have lots of thoughts about what you've said, but I would like to not hog the microphone. So I don't know if Jake or Jacob or Zara or Soraya, you'd like to say anything about what Daniel's been saying first.
I guess just a quick response to your last point. It was interesting that I think there were kind of similar projects bubbling up around the same time. There was so much kind of media coverage building up around the time our project started, and there was a sense that there was just such a general force pushing to gather these things and collect these things that we felt as though we were kind of engaging with. So it is curious that, yeah, like you say, at times of conflict there is some urge to record this stuff or collect this stuff. I guess to different ends each period. I guess that's partly what's interesting for us as psychoanalysis students who can draw on the work of Freud and on a subsequent century's worth of research, that we do have a slightly, just a slightly new way to look at these things, even compared to 50 years ago, 60 years ago, which has been really valuable in terms of reading the dreams and looking through them.
I was interested to hear what other people's comments were. I mean, everything Daniel said, completely agree with, but it's almost like, as Daniel said, every single thing we could talk about at length. It can go in so many different directions, the function, why we want to collect these dreams. Just from my perspective, as we were at the very early days of the pandemic, I have to stress there was such an outpouring on social media. I'm talking millions and millions of people were tweeting out or posting in different forums online. Hey guys, I'm having really vivid dreams. Is this happening to anyone else? And it was taking on such a just so many. It was almost like a whole phenomenon. Then the press started running articles saying everyone's having vivid dreams, and we could see this happening in real time. And it was almost like a lot of people were reading about this phenomenon of vivid dreams, and then that was triggering them to have vivid dreams themselves. So it was this kind of self-fulfilling phenomenon. And we just felt like we were really in the eye of a storm there. And we thought, wow, there's something really going on. This is valuable, it's magical. Let's try and mobilize and collect this. And then we can reflect later. So I just want to, I think that slide with all the headlines, I just want to take us back to right at the beginning of lockdown and how we were all feeling emotionally. There was so much chaos and individuals locked down, just tweeting out going, I need to share this experience. What does it mean? There was a real emotional sense of people reporting their dreams.
Just to respond to that, I mean, obviously, in a way, the internet facilitates your project greatly, that you can gather dreams from around the world in the way that you've been describing to us with great facility, and that this is a huge resource for academics and for anyone actually to bring things together, to create new kinds of hub and network. I think you're also saying that Twitter and Instagram and Facebook are already the archive for research. As for historians of the future, they will be able to look to exactly what you're describing if they're trying to sort of, in a way, explore the worlds of cultural fantasy and social and psychic life now in ways that are very different to the work of researchers who've tried to capture that moment in, if one thinks around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the early 60s, which maybe was a similarly febrile climate to now, but you don't have a Twitter feed in the way, Zara, you've just been describing. But you might look at, letters and diaries and songs. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of Bob Dylan's, one of his very first songs, Talking World War III Blues in 1963. Some time ago, a crazy dream came to me. I dreamt I was walking into World War III. I went to the doctor the very next day to see what kind of words he could say, etc. He said it was a bad dream. I mean, historians might look at popular music, but they don't have what you have now. And it also is part of the febrile climate that everything is circulating, going viral, and these sort of bubbles and silos which is part of the crisis of politics now to be faced, isn't it? Is what's happened online. So all of that is terribly important. I could say more about some of these earlier dream projects, but I think they are different because the conjuncture is different. you know, Bert Kaplan's project after the Second World War, that my colleague at Harvard, Rebecca Lemov, has written this book, Database of Dreams, about that post-war project. Or there's Seligman, the anthropologist, who, you know, in the interwar, and we've talked already about Charlotte Beradt and her project, but there's something different about now, which I think you were just kind of trying to describe and characterize. And that Liz was talking, I think this sense of going back to Freud's text on the uncanny is quite helpful, because as well as dreams, our sense of something that is hyper real and weirdly unreal and disturbing about this, the virtual existence we're all leading, including now, all of us. But as you've said, also the analytic world going online, we're all trying to adapt, patients, analysts. And, you know, it's a very strange time that may feel quite uncanny, both known and unknown in that sense of Freud, homely and unhomely.
I just would like to say something about this kind of general question of why is it that at certain times people feel this, you know, particular, we really must record our dreams, which has happened, you know, as you were saying, Daniel, not just at this time, but other times in the past. And my kind of general thought about that is that, you know, most of the time we go through life, a lot of the time, I think most of us go through life not really thinking that much about the fact that we have a mind and the work that our mind is doing to make sense of the reality that we're encountering. And just thinking about my own experience of when, you know, when it first became clear what was happening and that lockdown was coming, and then it happened, and, you know, there was so much anxiety around. And my sort of experience at that time was that I found it really difficult to think. You know, I was so anxious that I really couldn't think. It was really, really difficult. And that kind of focused my attention on, you know, what is up with my mind? Normally it just, you know, does its thing and I don't have to look under the bonnet. But right now I kind of need to look under the bonnet because it's getting in the way rather than helping me. So I think maybe that is one of the reasons why this happens. I'm conscious that there may be quite a few people who'd like to speak or ask questions. There's some questions in the chat. One question from Jean Arundel is whether the dream process is the site for the formation of crucial symbols, and cited, as it were, she says, on the border between body and mind. And then another question about the dreams that we've been receiving is, have we seen any increase in lucid dreaming or a greater influx from those who were already able to?
We didn't really have any questions about lucid dreaming. Obviously, the word vivid itself is prone to many interpretations. We haven't nailed it down in a way. So, you know, there's vividness in the sense that there's more to recall. Our memory of it is greatly increased, or vivid as compared to a normal dream, I guess. But in terms of lucid dreaming, we really didn't really look to collect anything about that specifically. So I think unless people mentioned it specifically, it wouldn't be really in our data set, to be fair.
I'm just going to pick up on one of these questions from John in the chat, saying frequency of dreams concerning people from the past, late parents providing reassurance. Yes, definitely. We've had some incredibly moving dreams from people saying that siblings that they've lost or parents that they've lost tragically in the past have come back and very vividly offered them reassurance that everything would be okay in this pandemic. There was also an incredibly moving dream about someone who had a dream where they thought that when lockdown was lifted, their father, who had actually died of COVID, sadly, was going to be returned back to them, and then woke up and realized, oh no, you know, he's dead. And when lockdown's lifted, he's not going to actually be coming back. So they'd made that association. But yes, lots and lots of scenarios of people dreaming of either estranged family members from the other side of the world, where they're all mingling again, or with parents or dead grandparents, and these are some of the most moving dreams that we've had. So yeah, there is a prevalence of that.
So I just to introduce myself. So I'm one of the researchers on Daniel Pick's Hidden Persuaders research group, and we've actually written a little bit about the virus and sort of people's experiences of it. So, you know, check out our website as well on that. But I just found it absolutely fascinating project. And one thing that just sort of was occurring to me when, you know, several people were talking is this kind of tension between when the dream becomes something that is reflective and when the dream itself becomes a sort of active agent in, you know, actually creating further dreams and so on. So the way that people sort of noticing through Twitter, through the internet and so on, how people have had these vivid dreams, some of the themes and metaphors might then actually enter into dreams in the process. And I think that, you know, it does raise a sort of more interesting question in psychoanalysis about, you know, to what, you know, how seriously should we really take dreams? You know, obviously in some sense, they can be that sort of window, you know, into the mind. And that's something that I think, especially kind of, you know, as, you know, living in a very kind of individualistic society, we're all very sort of curious about that. But at the same time, you know, where can actually reading into it become counterproductive in a sense? And I think, you know, I'm coming at this more from an anthropological background, but certainly different cultures, you know, dreams carry more or less significance. And my understanding is that, you know, in the Western psychoanalytic context, while dreams are something that's sort of taken very seriously, you know, there's a sense of kind of don't read too deeply into them. Whereas in some other cultures, actually dreams can be infused with a very kind of real spiritual significance, and can be seen as really, you know, another realm or even a sort of more real place, you know, that the sort of material world is an illusion to some degree, and actually the dream world is the real world. So it's a very different kind of take on it. And I wonder as well how, you know, if we were to look at the data, I mean, I understand that most of the data came from the UK, I think it was said, but if we did look at it from around the world and looked at, you know, people's kind of emotional responses to those dreams as well, whether that might kind of give us some more interesting insights.
Thanks, Naomi. That was really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think it is quite striking how, and this is definitely something that's very particular to this time, although it probably happened to a lesser degree in the past. But, you know, I think one of the things that happens is people read about these strange dreams that we've all been having, and then they produce dreams which often are very similar to the dreams that they've been reading about. And that has certainly happened to me, because I've read through the whole collection. And you know, when I was sort of intensively doing that, not this time, but the last time that I did it, then the following nights, I myself produced lots of dreams about trying to get to airports and not being able to get there and not being able to get all my stuff together to go on journeys. So that, you know, but what it kind of makes me think about is how we, you know, as a society, we're kind of, and this has always happened, whether it's online or in print or in oral narratives, we generate stories that then, and the stories we tell each other linger in each other's minds, and then that's kind of the furniture that's ready to hand in your mind when you produce a dream. So it may not have the same, you know, one dreamer may not have the same associations to a particular element as another, but we do see these kind of common elements recurring. I think that's quite interesting. Just going back to some of the things that Daniel was saying, which what you said made me think about again. So when I was reading, I'm actually teaching the interpretation of dreams at the moment, as it happens. And when I was reading it this time, two things struck me that had not struck me before. And I think it's because of my involvement in this project. One is the way that Freud in the book positions himself in alliance with the popular mind against the scientists. You know, he says quite often throughout the book, you know, the scientists tend to think that dreams are important, but the people have always known that there was something important about dreams. They didn't know what it was, but they've always known that they were important. And I'm here to tell you that they are important, and here's why. That's one thing. And the other thing is, I'd never really noticed, and you know, from your perspective, you might think, I can't believe she didn't notice this, but I'd never really noticed before how suffused with the political and the military, in the sense of, you know, Freud's situation in his society, the book actually is, even though, you know, he shares so many dreams that are revealing about his private life, but it also reveals a lot about his social context. And I wasn't sensitized to that before. And this project has, I think, is what has made me much more aware of that. And finally, on the kind of issue of, you know, the need for the dream as private associations versus the kind of earlier idea that one could produce a dream book that would allow a reliable translation of symbols. So yeah, it's definitely true in the interpretation of dreams that Freud is very much of the view that you have to get the individual associations. You cannot make sense of the dream by the manifest content alone. However, there is a section where he does also talk about dream symbols. And this was kind of added a bit later, I think, than the first edition of the book. That, you know, there are certain symbols that he and his colleagues notice crop up again and again and again. And he does think that you know, they can kind of put you on the trail of certain ideas and thoughts. But he gives the important caveat that, you know, we can think about symbols in dreams, and there are certain things that crop up, like representation. You can think, he suggests that you might often think about representations of internal spaces like rooms or caverns or boxes in terms of representations of the inside of the body. But he also says that these symbols frequently have more than one or even several meanings, and as with Chinese script, the correct interpretation can only be arrived at on each occasion from the context. So, you know, we might observe certain patterns of symbols, which is interesting and can be helpful up to a point. But when it comes to thinking about a particular individual and their dreams, you still have to, you know, find out what it means to them.
Just to respond to that as well, I mean, I think it must be right that one needs to be alert to different cultural frameworks or ways of understanding the dream that differ according to time and place. So that's important. I think what you're saying, Liz, also about the dream book, I mean, also that it was a work in progress, that it kept expanding. It was one of the texts he kept revising. Yeah. And that there were also contradictions, which you're pointing to, between, as it were, one view and another view that he holds, and the interest in patterns between people, even as he kind of undermines that notion with the idea of you need the association. So one of the things just a few other thoughts. One is just the experience of dreams that feel more integrative and dreams that feel more just like spinning one's wheels. And I think there's a book by the Swiss analyst Kinedo called Dreams That Turn Over a Page. Mm-hmm. About that. The dreams can also feel, you know, subjectively very different, or perhaps in analysis, some seem much more to be like some kind of working through a work in the dream that seems to bring things together, others that feel much more, I thought, as you were describing, this sort of restless, febrile kind of sense, or just waking up feeling not rested, which so many of us maybe have had this year. I was also just struck the sense of the uncanny this year, and because the focus here is literally on dreams, but one could say the world also of daydreams, the world of fantasy, that's an issue, and the sort of realm of fantasy that affects social and political life, of what is it that determines how people vote, based on what kind of fantasies operate in the political sphere. I mean, dreams would be one clue, but there might be others as well. And I was just thinking how in the First World War, Freud, in some of his letters, but also other writers like Rilke wrote about this, the sense of something uncanny about the war that had happened, that everyone or many people had feared could happen, and yet everyone had denied would ever happen. Mm-hmm. And there was something that felt very disturbing and uncanny about that being the present. And Freud writes, and Rilke, both of them in their letters, describe this, that it meant reconceptualizing the past on the basis of the present, sort of après coup, as he then, to use that Freudian idea, that it kind of reinvested the past with meaning. They'd often thought the 19th century was leading to progress. That was a common assumption, a sort of story about history that was widely shared, of development and progress. And the shattering realization or thought that it could all have led to here, that all that development led to this, that felt catastrophic and shattering, and yet predictable. So this mixture of the totally shocking and unforeseen and the sort of known, and this future perfect tense of what will have come to pass. And I think there's something about this year of all of the kind of the sense that something terrible was in the pipeline, that was in the zeitgeist, in the discourse around climate change, politics, everything. And then it came to this that feels very, very disturbing.
Yeah, I really agree with that. One of the things that I've sort of been thinking about in relation to this time is how we had the idea of ourselves as a species to which these kind of catastrophic illnesses would no longer happen, I think, even though we also did know that, in theory, there was always the possibility of a pandemic, and even, certain studies and preparation exercises have been done to think about how that might go, and then the results were ignored, it turns out. But yeah, that we suddenly find ourselves in a reality that both has been imagined and at the same time feels unimaginable, because there's a number of films as well about what would it be like if there were a pandemic, which have been quite popular since it actually happened. Jacob, you've been keeping an eye on the chat. Are there any questions that I can see that there's loads of questions. I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to address every questions, but do you want to bring one or two of them forward?
There was one that just cropped up that I thought could be interesting. It was to do with our thoughts on the gender imbalance in terms of responses. We had spoken about this a little bit earlier, I guess, in terms of the question of whether respondents were largely female due to an imbalance in the psychotherapy, psychoanalysis community, whether it was something to do with some, I don't know how to word it, some sense that maybe women were more comfortable disclosing private information, which is kind of a bit of a trope, but it's worth considering. But yeah, I thought the question to do with gender imbalance could be interesting to address if anyone has any thoughts on it. And that was there's a question from, let me double check, Naomi Richmond. Thank you for the question.
It's actually really interesting. There's been quite a few papers on the gender imbalance in taking part in surveys and things like that. I can't make any clear-cut sort of conclusions as to why that is the case in our collection, but I know it's a kind of generally held thing. I'm not sure if that's cause and effect collapsing slightly. But yeah, no, certainly interesting. Certainly interesting. I noted it for that point.
I'd like to make just a little quick comment picking up on something that Daniel said about the integrative function of dreams. There was one question that we had after people tell us their dreams. There's a question that said, what elements of the dream were unusual or new for you? And one answer to that really, really stood out. It was a very complex cinematic dream. And afterwards, the dreamer had listed the themes, 7 themes in that dream. And then he writes, each of these have importance in my waking life, and it's very unusual that they would appear like this together. I feel like my entire life has been told in a short scene or episode. And that really stood out to me when I read it, in the sense of really being this ideal kind of integrative dream. And so many people were saying, I felt this dream had a real meaning to me. I felt like it had revealed something, some kind of deep truth. And I think the other comment that I'd quite like to make generally, almost from behind the scenes, is that we had a lot of media engagement. There was, as I said earlier, a lot of producers were asking us to appear and talk about this project. And even myself, I was doing some interviews where there were neuroscientists or people from a more kind of hard scientific background. And I noticed that all of these other scientists who wouldn't normally be talking about dreams as having meanings, they may be talking about like the neurobiology of dreams, they were all saying, oh, dreams were a kind of sleep therapy, or they were kind of leaning towards that. And it was as if that nobody wanted to hear, oh, actually, vivid dreams are just a meaningless waste product of the mind. There was a real sense from both the media almost chasing our project and asking us to come forward with psychoanalytic observations, and from all the people that replied, that whatever the hard science may say, and I put that in quote marks, they sensed their dreams were meaningful and important and integrative in this way. And I think that goes back really interestingly to what you said, Liz, that about Freud being on the side of the people, that like the common folk know there's something in it and almost won't be told otherwise by the biology of the mind. And that came across strongly here as well.
Further to the issue of integrative dreams, so Michael, this is a kind of, you know, this is not scientific, it's kind of impressionistic, but just, you know, reading through everything that's been submitted so far, you could almost schematize and say there's two reasons why people, there's more than two, but there are two that stand out why people submit their dreams. One is because they've had a dream that they feel somehow kind of pleased by or really interested in, or they feel that there's something really important about this and I don't know what it is, but let me at least put it on record somewhere. So there's that category, and on the other hand, there's the category of those who just feel incredibly disturbed by what they've dreamed, and you know, and sort of maybe kind of putting it out there, putting it away, putting it in someone else's hands. So yeah, so, and I think it, you know, I've been thinking about Freud's writings on dreams throughout his, you know, the development of his thinking, and you know, initially he insisted that all dreams are the fulfillment of wishes. You know, all dreams are the fulfillment of wishes. That's it. There's no more to say. But it was actually, I think it was importantly the experience of World War I. That was one of the things that led him to begin to rethink that, because he had to confront the phenomena of traumatic dreams, where people, you know, would have dreams where they would just be put back in the same situation again and again and again, living through the same horrible scenario again and again and again. And he says in beyond the pleasure principle. This astonishes people far too little.
Yeah.
You know, this actually is going to mean that I need to think hard about the model of the mind that I've developed so far, because what is going on there, and he kind of provisionally understands it in terms of a need to master the overwhelming stimulus that comes before the kind of normal functioning of the mind can come into play.
I think that's very helpful that you take us to beyond the pleasure principle and Freud having to rethink, and trauma and dreams really, and anyway his struggle with that to sort of make sense, or the sense of something unmasterable, because I suppose there's the integrative idea, but there's also the sense of having to face in our dreams that we're not integrated, and the fantasy of oneness or singularity that is belied by our dreams, even dreams that we quite like. Our sense of being strangers to ourselves, or in many bits of identity at once, and so on. And that there is no neat single explanation, and that's what he kind of comes up against and faces. And he goes on. I think the idea for him is that the book and the project of interpreting dreams is still foundational, and that it's sort of absolutely that he says somewhere, it's sort of, insight like this comes but once in a lifetime. I mean, that the dream book is privileged in a way. Just two other thoughts on gender. I thought it would be interesting to know whether the mass observation project of the 1930s in Britain, where they gathered so many dreams, whether there was the same, prevalence of women compared with men volunteering dreams to mass observation. I was also just struck, it would be interesting to revisit it, made a sort of splash in the 1970s, but the German historian Klaus Teweleit's book, or 2-volume collection called Male Fantasies, which was about the post-First World War Freikorps, the sort of militias that gathered to support the Nazi Party. And it was based on the diaries and letters, private letters of many of the men who took part in these far-right militias, and the mixture of sexual and political fantasy, for instance, about red women, Bolshevik women. But anyway, it just came to my mind when you were saying about that, and other projects that have thought from the point of view of gender about politics, fantasy, dreaming would be interesting. Oh, and finally, just you both Zara and Liz, you in a way take us to cinema with the cinematic dreams, and because I thought what Zara said reminded me when, Liz, you were quoting the passage about the train in the Uncanny, and I was thinking the beginning of cinema begins with the Lumiere brothers, the train crash, the idea of a train coming towards the screen, and the image of a moving train that's often been used about cinema, the moving frame. You film the moving carriage, and that one could think of your project. It would be interesting to think about cinema and the role of popular cinema in trying to sort of, in a way, think of, as well as surrealism and so on. But I mean, if you think of Hitchcock and Spellbound and the great dream sequence there, or David Lynch, one could think in the cinema of the attempt to sort of get to something about the world of dreams, and and to sort of try to visualize something, and the power of that. And that the history of cinema and the history of psychoanalysis are so parallel. They emerge at the same time, and we live in an age of psychoanalysis and cinema, and now, of course, the screen, the internet.
Yeah, I can't remember. I was trying to remember this before the meeting. Somebody has written that perhaps Freud's vision of the mind would not have been possible without the development of cinema at the same time. And I was also thinking of, when Freud sets out the topographical model in the interpretation of dreams and introduces the idea of psychical locality, he quotes from Fechner and Fechner's comment that dreams are an other scene. And I was thinking, that maybe that other scene is the cinema screen. not for Fechner, but,
Daniel, you mentioned about mass observation. The interesting thing about that is I think the majority of respondents were female in that particular, especially in the dream collection, because they did a dream collection around the outbreak of war. And I think that was repeated subsequently every year. I've actually got in front of me one of the papers from the Mass Observation Archive. So this is pretty pertinent. So mass observation was a broadly anthropological project undertaken from 1937 onwards in the UK. Around the outbreak of war, they got on board a psychoanalyst called Dr. R.A. MacDonald from the Institute. And they asked him to comment on the dreams that they'd gathered. So this is from his letter outlining some common themes. Okay, so the first thing he says is there's a comparatively small proportion of the dreams that immediately relate to war. So the interesting thing that we're finding is that there's kind of metaphoric relations with COVID. There are direct representations, but also we're looking at the metaphoric relations. And so he goes on. The anxiety situation very frequently relates to some danger situation in which A, the person is unable to move, B, they're going to be late, C, they've forgotten something, D, they don't have the appropriate statement to ward off the danger, E, on circumventing the danger another takes its place, and F, the dreamer nearly always wakes up on failing to avoid the danger. I mean, this is so broad, this is very generic, but we're finding exactly the same things. Like I was talking earlier about the inside and outside the home, you know, boundaries are really enforced in what we're seeing. You know, the differentiation between the home and outside and danger and safety is so prevalent that things like transportation become very risky endeavors within the dream. And so you often find a flight that you've missed, like you said, Liz, or like a bus that breaks down when you get on, or a car that seems to be driving the wrong way. These things just recur and recur and recur. I've kind of gone on a bit of a rant, but it's interesting to bring it back to mass observation, because there is precedent within the UK for things like that. And it's so interesting to look over the data. Sorry, if someone else wants to chip in.
Well, it's very interesting to look at that and, you know, mass observation. So thank you. I jotted down, sort of just thinking today about our meeting, from Melanie Klein's narrative of a child analysis, the Richard case, which would be the opposite way to go, into one case, which is her most detailed. You know, she gives you the process notes, or sort of a lot of the actual material. And in the 9th session, that Richard said, so this is in the book, Richard said that he had an important question which he was going to put to Mrs. Klein when they were back in the playroom, because they were walking around having their sort of session outside. But then he asked it straight away: could she help him not to have dreams? Mrs. Klein asked him why he did not want to have dreams and why he did not want to tell her this now. Richard explained that his dreams were always frightening or unpleasant. He also said he was afraid of being overheard by any children they might meet. All the time he had been speaking in whispers and so on. Anyway, it turns out that really what she's talking about, the sense of the war and the prevalence that you're saying, the direct references as well as the more oblique references to the times, the crisis of the time, the sense of threat, mortal threat of bombing of Hitler that features. Anyway, it's so beautifully captured in that text of Klein's and in Richard's material. So I was thinking, are there also other cases from the past? that the one way is to go sort of laterally into mass observation or these big projects. The other is to find specific cases that sort of enable one to sort of drill in a bit more in depth, like there.
Another source that it occurs to me it would be interesting to look at is The Hands of the Living God, Marion Milner's book about this one schizophrenic patient, which also is in the context of a time of turmoil, if I remember rightly. I am very sad to say that we are going to have to finish for the evening, which is a shame because there's so much more that we could talk about, and I very much regret that we've not been able to get to all the questions in the chat. I think we'll think about perhaps doing something else as a follow-on to this. I hope people will be interested in rejoining us for that. But for now, I'd just like to say two final things. One is we've included in the chat a link to a feedback survey. We'd be so grateful if you could take a few minutes to fill that out. We're always trying to improve the events that we do, and we're still learning about how to do this virtual thing, so we'd really appreciate your feedback. Secondly, I just want to thank Daniel and Jake and Jacob and Zara and Soraya for being here tonight and for joining in such a fascinating discussion, which I wish could continue. Thank you to Nicola Harding and Christine Jackson, who've organised this so beautifully for us too. Oh yes, and do remember that we're still very interested in your dreams. So if anyone should have an interesting dream tonight or in the nights to come, then we'd be most interested in hearing about it. So I think we're going to close there. Thank you so much again, everybody. Really enjoyed having you with us, and goodbye for now. And I wish you interesting dreams. Thank you. Bye-bye.